I'm going to give you a little bit of history about how I met Jeff, and I think Dave's going to be joining us as well. Can we get Jeff on screen at some point? Yeah, everyone can see you now. Jeff, give us a wave. Can everyone say hello, Jeff?
Hello, Jeff.
Hi, everyone.
Okay, so Jeff is an illustrator and animator, and he's awesome. He's also part of the Drink and Draw Social Club. I many years ago was in New York, and I stole the idea for our Drink and Draw. I don't know if any of you came last night from them, but he doesn't know that. And the reason that this whole festival happened is because of the fact that I was getting correspondence for the Drink and Draw Social Club, and they were getting correspondence for us. So we were speaking about an international drink and draw. We then pulled it out into a festival, and up until, was it last week, Jeff? Up until last week, Jeff and Dave were gonna be here. It was gonna be amazing. This panel was gonna happen here. They were gonna be at the drink and draw, and then international flight laws screwed us, didn't they?
A bit of a kerfluffle.
Yeah, it was a kerfuffle. It was a real kerfuffle. So we were talking, and going to speak to Jeff about his work, his process, the stuff he's done as an animation designer, and indeed an illustrator working on some books. And Jeff, if I ever get any of the terminology wrong, or if you think there's anything that I am absolutely mangling, tell me to shut up and you take over. So okay. So without further ado, I'm going to introduce Jeff, and he can tell you a little bit about his work, and then we can get into process and how he works as an illustrator and how he works as an animator. So over to you, Jeff.
Hi, everyone. So I started off my career as a comic book artist, primarily a penciler. In high school, my friend and I had a newspaper strip that we sold to the local newspaper that was sort of a sci-fi action adventure thing. It was very, very high school. But out of high school, I joined the Army, and I was an illustrator for a psychological operations unit. And then I broke into comics when I was around my early 20s. And my first big book was at Marvel, Wonder Man. It was a long time ago, but it was a very fun book. And then I bounced around in comics for about 15 years. And then after CrossGen, I did a book at CrossGen called Way of the Rat, which was a martial arts adventure kung fu book set in a version of ancient China with dragons and whatnot. I then moved into animation when Dave Johnson was leaving Warner Brothers as a background artist on the Justice League Unlimited. He went over to design Ben 10. I don't know if you guys have heard of that or not. And then I did animation for about 10 or 15 years, and then I moved to Oregon, and now I do a little bit of both freelance from the woods.
Cool, thank you very much. I'm just going to try and get the guys to swap the screen feed so that I can put up some of your images and we can talk through them. Can you see the images on screen, Jeff?
It's a little bright. Can you tell me which one that is?
That is the Green Lantern page. And,
okay.
Okay, Green Lantern page. I think it's Legion page.
Okay. So the Green Lantern work was written by my friend Ron Mars, and that particular issue is an annual that I did that takes place in an imaginary world that's inside a painting. And since Kyle is an artist, he winds up getting sucked into the painting and using the power of his ring to save this alternate imaginary dimension, and sort of become. And while he's there, he has a John Carter of Mars, Tarzan, kind of Al Williamson adventure. So one of the things I loved about that book was that the thing I like most about drawing in general is just coming up with just sitting down. One of the reasons I like Drink and Draw so much is because you just sit down and you just draw for fun. And one of the things I like drawing for fun the most is guys riding centaurs and dragons and sword fights and all that Flash Gordon stuff. So this book was entirely that. And since my friend Ron wrote it and he knew that that's the kind of stuff that I really enjoyed, I pretty much designed the entire world before he wrote the story.
That's really cool. Can you talk about your process? So when you break down a page, how do you start? How do you start your specific process?
So it really depends on who is writing the book, but generally speaking, the writer will give me the scripts I like working from the most are a combination of the old school Marvel plot style and the more DC full scripted style. I like a little bit of a mixture. So I like the freedom to draw what I feel is the best picture, but I also like as much information about what the writer is looking for as possible. That way I can get a clear picture. I read the script all the way through, and then I try and get a mental movie going. And then I read the script again, more specifically trying to figure out which pictures would be the best to share that movie. And then I do little thumbnails in the side of the script where I do like initial breakdowns of I think these are the images that will convey the story the best. And then I take those little thumbnails and I will start actually drawing a page. And so I will lay a page out in light pencil, and then I will clean it up and tighten it up in ballpoint pen. And then from there, I will trace that off. So I do that on 8.5 by 11, just tracing, like just normal tracing paper, writing paper. And then I will make this, then I'll blow that up and trace that off onto the standard 11 by 17 page and move stuff around and change things and make sure that the page works as a whole image, as well as a collection of panels that tell a story. And then that can take anywhere from 8 to 15 hours, depending on how much work I've made for myself. And then that will go on to an inker.
Do you ink your own work, or do you work with an inker?
I do ink my own stuff. I'm currently inking the book I'm working on at Image right now called Rogue's Kingdom. It's once again, my niche. It's a swords and sorcery fantasy book that James Robertson is writing. So that book I'm inking myself, but that's mostly just because it's creator owned and our budget is limited. So I'm doing it that. I'm not really a great inker. Okay. Dan and Dave, the other two guys from Drink and Draw, are way, way better at the finished drawing than I am.
I think you're underselling yourself. This is exceptional. So these are more, so we've got GLA Nightmare and the interiors page, I believe that's Bizarro.
Yeah.
So this would be an earlier stage of the process. At which point do you nail down your layouts? At which point have you gone, okay, I'm happy with this. This tells the story I want it to tell. The flow is right and the pacing is right. Are these images indicative of you actually nailing down the process?
Yeah, so the page on the left is an old page from Justice League Nightmare, I think. Yeah, I can't remember the name. Yeah, so it's Midsummer Nightmare. And that panel is, I put those up because I wanted to talk about the difference between sort of active and passive storytelling. Yeah. And so the left-hand side is basically, it's the same shot and it's very passive. The characters they're speaking, they're having an interaction. And then there's not really any camera movement. There's not really any trick. It's just a straight up frame. So what's happening inside the panel is what's important. On the other one, the Bizarro page, I can't quite remember which one I sent you, but I know that for that one, I changed panel dynamics a little bit. And that is much more of the panel shape itself is, supposed to affect the story. And then also that one I just did the pencils for. And then I also did, sometimes I'll throw in a gray layer to show the lighting, depending on who's inking and who's coloring.
Sorry, yes, you could see the difference. What's really nice about the Bizarro page, it's the page where he looks like he's being electrocuted. But nice about the Bizarro page, it looks like you've actually designed a room and then have been moving the camera around the room. Would that be an explanation of the way you work?
I did. So one of the things, that page, yes, he is getting turned in, like, he's transforming. Lex Luthor has turned a regular guy into a Superman, and then that Superman, because the process, turns into a Bizarro. So the difference between those two pages is about 15 years. And when I did the Justice League page, I did that when I had only worked in comic books. And when I did the Bizarro page, I had been working in animation for a long time. I think that particular issue was done while I was also working on Batman Bad Blood. I don't know if there was the DVD with Robin and I think Batwoman's in that one. But that one's, I can't remember the family ties. I worked on a lot of Batman DVDs. So I've been working in animation for a long time. And one of the tools I discovered in animation was 3D modeling in SketchUp. And so as a storyboard artist, you use a lot of 3D models to, especially if you're working on a 3D show, to move the camera around and to position characters. And so that, because in animation, someone else is providing the backgrounds. So when I do comics now, I often will build myself the background so that I know exactly where everyone's standing. That way the reader feels as though they're really in the room and everything is consistent.
Yeah, it's obvious and it's really, really evident. And over your years as an animator, have you developed tricks and indeed procedures to be able to tell a story in a different way? For example, a low camera angle will indicate tension or unease in the room. Is there stuff that your experience has allowed you to do having come back into comics?
Absolutely. I draw comics completely differently now after years of doing. So one of the great things about animation is that that each job is its own profession. Like the background guy is a dedicated background guy. The prop guy is a dedicated prop guy, and so on with the storyboard artist and the prop designers and all. Every one of those guys is amazing, and they hone their craft to a level of excellence that's very difficult to get to in comics because you have to do everything. The lucky thing about comics is the training in comics gives you a very basic understanding of all those fields. And then when I moved into animation, I was able to hone individual skills. I was a background guy for a while, I was a character guy for a while, and I was a storyboard guy for a while. And each one of those specific jobs, I learned a lot. And so when I came back to comics, it changed the way that I did things. Specifically, what you're talking about is the storytelling. When you do storyboards, as opposed to comics, you have to work with time in a different way. When you draw comics, you are creating the illusion of time, of however you want to break that down with your panel borders and your panel shapes. And then when you draw in animation, you are actually locked into just 24 frames per second. So the way you use time is differently. And so you learn, one of the things I learned in animation was 100% where to put my camera to add the emotion to what was happening in a set frame of time. Like a low angle definitely makes things more tense and makes the viewer feel as though they are in danger. A higher angle definitely keeps them away from the action and gives them sort of a dislocated, dispassionate God's eye view. So if you want just to give someone information, set the camera up higher. If you want the characters to be kind of on an equal level, your villain or your protagonist and your antagonist, you give him an eye level line. Or if you're just trying to get the reader involved or the viewer involved on strictly a non-emotional level. But then when you want to start playing with how the reader feels, then you start raising or lowering the camera where you place it really affects the emotional.
Oh, we've lost you, Dave. We've lost your sound.
You lost my sound?
Oh, you're back.
Okay, sorry about that.
Okay. Regarding the JLA Nightmare page, now that you're looking at it after 15 years away, obviously, you know, you left comics at 15 and now back 15 years later. How would you handle it differently? What would you do different?
So I would do everything different now. The thing about learning how to tell a story as a comic book artist, it's you piece it together, right? You read books about storytelling, you study movies. It's a very personal journey on learning the basics. But one of the great things about animation is that you are surrounded by veterans who will tell you everything you need to know about how to basically make a movie. And as a storyboard artist, you have to make sure that your camera movements work in the same way that on a page you have to make sure that your panels work together. And the intensive training of animation and storyboard work really changed the way I moved my camera and composed shots. Like, I'll be honest, when I was drawing comics, I did not know what the rule of third was.
Can you explain that to our audience?
So the rule of thirds is basically breaking up any picture with two parallel lines down the middle, and two or horizontal lines down the middle and two vertical lines down the middle. And so those 4 points where they intersect are where the eye naturally goes. And so you want to put the most important elements either within that square or on one of those points, so that and each one of those points also represents an emotional relationship to the people in the frame and the people looking at the frame. And it is one of the most basic, fundamental aspects of composing a picture. And I didn't know it until I was in my late 30s.
Thank you. I'm just going to talk to the audience slightly. If you have a look at the Bizarro page, it's really, really evident. I mean, if you look at the center panel, his fists and his feet and Lex Luthor's head are in that central square. The next panel along, his elbows, which are the foreground, it's the point at which he's breaking the panel. They are in that area, and if I may be so bold, Dave, this is an exceptional example of storytelling. It's really, really good. Dave, sorry, Jeff. Jeff, you sent us this image, which I think is lovely. It's Supergirl holding a red ring. I wanted to show the audience because it is wonderful. Can you talk a little bit about your process in how you created this, how you chose the foreground and the background, and what emotion you wanted to convey?
Well, so that I did a Supergirl issue. Once again, I think one of the criticisms I got when I was doing comic books and animation at the same time was that some of the editors thought my figures had become a little elongated. And that was definitely part of my animation background, because you're taught to exaggerate a little bit more, and you learn how to use shapes a little bit differently than I did. So that's one of my character designs have improved quite a bit since animation also. But for that particular image, the story was that she was fighting, I forget the name of the villain, but she was losing, and she had the red ring, and it was affecting her. And the only way she could really destroy the villain, who was also attached to the rings, was by flying it into the sun. And so so I put the ring, obviously I put it dead center, and then I had her holding it. And so the lines, if you can see the real trick to look at to a good drawing, in my opinion, is what is the underdrawing doing? Like, where are the lines and the intersections of the underdrawing? So the ring is dead center. Her eyes point towards it. Her fingers point towards it. The cape points towards it. The explosion is coming from not quite the ring center, but close to the ring center of all the planets coming out from behind her. And then I really wanted your eye to be drawn to the ring. And then all the other shapes, the planets around it. Yes, I wanted to evoke the idea of a solar incidence, like a solar nova, and then planets being formed and entire worlds behind her. But mostly I wanted the pattern to be detailed and point towards the center, but not require a lot of attention from the reader.
It's a remarkable image because it has such depth. Were you the colorist as well?
No. Cam Smith inked it, and I sadly cannot remember the name of the colorist, but he did a fantastic job.
It's a really lovely image. I have a couple of questions about the difference between animation and illustration. So you've worked in comics and animation. Let's take a character like Batman, for example, very brooding, very dark. On the comic page, he's conveyed with a lot of black. You can't do that on TV. So how do you handle the difference between Batman on the page and Batman on the screen?
That's a really interesting question. I think, yeah, because you're right. When you're drawing, well, at least when I'm drawing Batman, my take on him is to almost always put him in the shadows, and he has a lot of black in his costume. And so even if he's standing in the middle of a room, he definitely looks shadowy and black. But when you're doing it in animation, I find the trick to really making him feel, because the colors and the atmosphere are almost always done by a different person. And so my job on Batman, whenever I draw him in the DVDs, was I tried to make sure that he moved like Batman, that I captured the not necessarily the shadows, because you can't put the shadows in when you're doing a storyboard. It's just too complicated, and it doesn't actually work for the overseas drawing it. That's something that's done in color. And so you have to trust your color designer to really handle that. But I would just try to make sure that his mood and his shadowiness and his sulkiness were conveyed in the way that he would stand, in the way that he would move, and that I always had him sort of drifting and not doing the standard up and down walk. Like I had him slide more than I would have him. His walk cycle was much more of a glide than a walk cycle.
Cool, because there's when Bruce did Tim, he didn't create. When Bruce Timm and Paul Dini did Batman the Animated Series, they almost added to his costume the triangle of lighter color that fell across his shoulders, which was a really clever way of breaking his face up and his head up from backgrounds. Is there tricks like that that you employ that you can sort of fudge the eye so that actually Batman is more present, or indeed any character that is a very dark character?
Yeah, for one, going back to the rule of thirds, when you want the character to be dominant, right, you put him in the center. You put his eyes right on that center line, that top center line, or right in the middle of the rule of thirds in that center. Like that makes him the focus of the panel. But then if you want him to be shifting, depending on where his story arc is, if he's in the beginning of the story, you'd put him on the left. And if he's in if he's moving towards the end of the story, like if he's progressing, I would put him more on the right, depending on where the plot is. So, and then the further you have him on the sides, the more he just sort of fades out of your attention space. So if you wanted him to drift into the shadows, you just sort of slide him off to one side or the other. And then when you cut and he's not in the next scene, it feels like he just disappeared. So there are tricks like that. Also, whenever you're framing stuff, putting him in, well, a super easy one is just to put him in a doorway or an archway, or to sit him on top of something that with buildings pointing at him, where his silhouette does so much the work for you.
It's so iconic, isn't it?
Yeah.
So I have a question, which might be a bit cheeky. As Batman has a floor-length cape, can you get away without animating the walk cycle, or do you have to put the walk cycle in so that you can, so that you're aware of the pacing?
You know, that is an interesting question. The trick with the cape is it's always circumstantial, right? It's situational. If he's being ghost-like, then you use the cape almost as though he's floating on smoke. If he's in the middle of a fight, you pretty much try and keep the cape just out of the way, and like you have to do your best to pretend it's not part of the situation, unless he's using it, you know, like to cover his face or to do something like that. And then when he's just walking, it's the trick with the cape is, depending on his walk or run cycle, how fast he's going is how much it's touching the ground or not touching the ground. So if he's at a dead run, it's just straight back. But like if he's sort of strolling or being menacing, depends on where. So that angle of the cape gives you a real good tool to show where he is emotionally.
That's really cool. It's really interesting. Neil Adams, obviously the dynamic of Batman changed incredibly when Neil Adams came on board, because Batman's, as you know, Batman's cape just used to hang. It would just hang off him. And then Neil Adams came up with the concept that you actually put the cape in the most dynamic pose possible. So the cape became a character in its own right.
Absolutely.
Is that something that you guys do, for example, on Batman the Brave and Bold, which you were involved in? Is that something you guys discussed, Batman's cape becoming its own character?
Yeah, well, you want to use everything, animation is great because you get to add movement, and that gets to tell a lot of the story. But your drawings have to be incredibly simplified because they have to be drawn so many millions of times. And plus there's time constraints, and it's easier to draw certain shapes more than others. So you have to really use every tool at your disposal to get the story across. And that's using all kinds of tricks. Like you pointed out on the Bizarro page, I had an elbow as a framing device, depending on where you put the camera, that will do a lot of the heavy lifting for your story. But when it comes to something like Batman's cape or Wonder Woman's shield or her lasso, you do have to treat them as though they are separate entities and let them tell the story. Like you have to give them a bit of the spotlight because what super trick is, it's easier to animate a cape and a lasso, an object in that way to tell some of the story than it is to animate the person. It looks cool, and it's cost effective.
Well, it's like Captain America's shield being an extension of his emotional self.
Exactly.
Would you be kind enough to tell our audience which animated shows I know this because, as you know, I've geeked out with you on Skype before. Would you tell the audience which animated shows you've worked on, please?
I started off doing Justice League Unlimited as a background artist. I moved over to the Boondocks also as a background artist for most of my career. Like the beginning of my career, I thought I was going to be a background artist. And then while I was on the Boondocks, the second season of the Boondocks, they were having trouble finding a character artist because the style of the show was anime, heavily anime influenced, but there were also a lot of likenesses that needed to be done for the Boondocks. And they couldn't find anyone who could do the anime style, but then also sort of nail a semi-realistic likeness. And my time in comics, and I'd done some Star Wars comics and I'd done likeness comics before, so I'd had some practice doing that. So I actually moved out of backgrounds and into characters while on the Boondocks. And I did that for a couple of years. And then from the Boondocks, then I moved on to Spectacular Spider-Man, and I did storyboard revision and storyboard, and I helped a little bit out with characters on that. Sean Galloway was the character designer, Cheeks. He was amazing, but it was a very heavy character show, and so I did some background help and helped him turn some things occasionally. And then what did I do? Then I did some Transformers. And then I did some Avengers Mightiest Heroes, and then some more Transformers, and then Young Justice, and then a ton of the Warner Brothers DVDs, Apocalypse with Supergirl, Batman Bad Blood, Batman Family Ties, a couple other that I can't think of at the moment, some Brave and the Bold, and then recently I did Harley Quinn. I know I'm forgetting a couple.
Which you work mainly in the DC world. Which do you prefer? This is such a geeky question. I apologize. Which do you prefer, working in the world of DC, Warner Brothers Animation, or working on Spider-Man? And I am a huge fan of Sean Galloway as well. So his Cheeks, his elongated Spider-Man. The webbing is a character in its own right. Is amazing. But sorry to go back to the question, which do you prefer working in? Which characters do you prefer drawing?
Well, I'll tell you a quick story about Sean. So a lot of us, including Joaquin dos Santos, who is directing the new Spider-Man animated movie. I don't know if that's common knowledge or not. I hope I didn't just spill beans. But so
Sorry,
Joaquin,
say that again. That sounded like an exclusive.
right. So Joaquin, Sean, myself, Dan Panosian, and a couple other guys tried out for the lead character designer of Spectacular Spider-Man. And I thought that I had done a pretty good job. I'd drawn Spider-Man as a comic. And so I thought I had a pretty good take on him. And then when I saw Sean's take on the Spectacular Spider-Man, when I saw his submission, I just knew I'd lost. I'm like, oh, they're gonna go with Sean. It's so good. It's so unique. It looks so cool. It was one of those moments where I thought I had nailed it, and I realized I hadn't even come close. But when it comes to drawing, yeah, Sean's a monster. So when it comes to drawing for Marvel or DC, the Spider-Man show was a fun show. But when you do animation, it's the show itself, the work itself is pretty much the same. And it really depends on the environment that you're working in. And at that time, we were in a place called the Apple Building on Spider-Man, and it was not a great place to work. It was not in a great part of town. It was bad parking. There was nothing, it used to be an old warehouse for props. So it was not a great place to work. It was a really fun show to work on, and the people were great, but I didn't like the environment as much. And you have to go there, and you're there for 12 hours a day. Warner Brothers is by far the best. Working on the ranch in Burbank it's the best place to work. They film a lot of TV there. That's where the Friends fountain is at. And so working on the Warner Brothers lot is the best. So working for Warner Brothers is fantastic. It's the best place to work. The locations are the best. The chairs are the most comfortable.
So you have answered my question with the most comfortable chairs. Doesn't matter on the character. It's just the most comfortable
yeah, right.
chairs.
I mean, because I've worked in a lot of different little studio settings, and generally speaking, the job is mostly the same. And the people in animation are all pretty awesome. And so the crews are all really, really great. So the real only distinction is what is the office like? And Warner Brothers does have the best chairs. They have the best computers. Except for when I worked on the Transformers for a while, that place was pretty great.
Sounds amazing. What was your favorite purely work-based, not talking about the chairs, we can leave chairs aside now. Purely work-based, what was the project that you worked on that you were most proud of?
So I worked on Transformers Prime. It was a CG show, and it was a little more mature than I think some of the other Transformers shows. It was aimed at a little bit of an older audience. And I have to say that being part of that was probably I'm most proud of that series. I think that's as a fan, that's my favorite Transformers series. And as an artist, we got to do some really cool stuff with the characters, and we did some really great action. And then the final look of the show, I think, is stunning all around. If anyone hasn't seen it, I would say check out Transformers Prime. But most recently, I did a few episodes of Harley Quinn, and it's the only show that my wife actually likes. So I got a lot of kudos for working on a show that she watches.
Well, I did a drawing the other day, and my girlfriend Ali said, "Oh, I finally like some of your work," which was lovely to hear. You've worked in the animation industry for within the last 2 decades. Did you see, or were you witness to, the transition from working purely on paper and cell to actually working on a Cintiq and software like Adobe Animate and Premiere and stuff? So I would imagine your timeline corresponds with that change in the industry. Was it a difficult period to adjust, and did different animation studios change over at different times?
I think so. When I worked on Spectacular Spider-Man, they were first starting to bring in Toon Boom. And so first starting it to bring it in as a storyboard tool. And I remember the guys from Canada came down and actually gave us some demos, and they were selling it and pitching it, but also letting us know what sort of what the industry was moving towards. But we were still working on paper. We were still hand lettering, hand numbering.
Cool. My apologies. Can you just, in a couple of sentences, can you just break down what Toon Bow is to the audience, please?
Oh, Toon Boom. So Toon Boom, also I think it's called Storyboard Pro.
Sorry, it is Toon Boom. Sorry, my apologies.
Yeah. So Toon Boom is basically it's an animation. It's a storyboard animation program that in the olden days you would draw on paper, and then you would 3 panels per page, normally landscape style, and then you would just flip the storyboards, and you would see how the action flowed, and then you sent that chunk of paper overseas, and they used that as the template to do the animation, which they still do a lot of times on paper, I believe, right? They do that classic flippy thing, right? But then when you work on Toon Boom, you draw on the Cintiq, and you draw those panels on on this computer screen, and it becomes a frame of the animatic, which you then can play like a little movie. And so it's more work intensive, but it's faster. But you can also, the thing that you can't do when you're flipping paper is control how fast that goes. And so in Toon Boom, you can actually say, this is 7 frames, this is 10 frames. And when you get down to a fight scene, you can actually put it on 2s or 1s, depending on how good your animation is going to be. So it's basically the storyboard artist went from working on paper and providing mostly the layout, the blueprint, to actually building an animatic that is timed. You don't do 100% of the timing. You don't do all the drawings. You still are hitting mostly just the keyframes, but you're also adding the audio track. So you listen to the audio track, you add the audio track, and you time out everything to match the audio track. So the storyboard artist really is building the animatic and has become a filmmaker, which is really tough. It's great because you get to see it and you have so much control, but it's really tough because you're also doing a basic timing, and that used to be someone else's job. Who, I don't know how old school you guys are, but like the timer used to flip those pages, and with a stopwatch they would think how long it would take for each panel, and they would write a little timesheet on the storyboard. So that would be part of what went overseas. And so the person who was animating it would see, this is 3 seconds, that's this many frames, and so I have to stretch this action out as the timer has dictated, because then the whole show was timed out. One of the things, I don't know if you've ever seen any old of Bruce Timm Batman storyboards, but they're glorious drawings. But when Batman does a flip, there's basically, he starts, and then there's a flip arrow, and then he lands. Well, that's not how we do it anymore. Now you draw every aspect of that flip. So you basically keyframe it. And so when he lands, you see the motion, right? So I would never say I've animated anything, but I've done keyframes on a lot of shows.
Cool. That's genuinely really interesting. Thank you. I'm just going to say to the audience, if you can find the book Batman the Animated Series by Chip Kidd, it is wonderful. It has that sequence in it that Jeff is talking about, and it is just the most beautiful book. And I think the first 6 or 7 pages are just Bruce Timm's storyboards. And if you have any interest, not just in animation, but in comics as well, they're a joy to behold, aren't they? That book is stunning.
Oh, it's amazing. So I think talking about the difference between comics and animation today is that the way you tell a story now as a storyboard artist is much more like an animator, where you are doing keyframes, you are moving the camera around, you're much more of a director now than you used to be. When you were doing storyboards before, like say during the Bruce Timm era, and just when I got in, you were much more of a comic book artist. You were picking the shot and drawing the shot, and the boards were way tighter. They had more actual black in them. but the act of animation was left up to the next guy. Because now you would never draw it. I mean, you might draw an arrow if there was a swerve or something, if you're drawing a car. But now the way we do it is you actually pose stuff out. So the arrow in itself is not as much of a tool that storyboard artists use as much, that they used to use quite a bit.
Do you have a library of assets? So, for example, you know, if you're putting a car in a storyboard or boarding a chase scene, that you have a library of cars, station wagons, saloons, sports cars, that you can just speed up the process. Is that one of the benefits of working digitally?
So when I did a couple of episodes of Star Wars Force of Destiny, which was made for littler kids, and then one of the tools that they gave us to work on that is, I cannot remember the name of the 3D model that actually fits in Toon Boom. So you can actually have it as it's part of your library. So in your library, you have your audio tracks, and then you'll have some backgrounds. And then in this particular job, part of our assets was a 3D model of the snow speeders. And so when you're doing your finished storyboard, you pull in the 3D model and you place it in the panels. And so it's super convenient. I mean, it makes the board look great. It's really easy for the animator to see what's happening next. And it's fun to basically pose a little toy in your drawings.
You have my email address, so I'd quite like that if you can send it to me.
You know what? I'll send. I'm sorry I didn't do it before. I didn't think about it, but I'll send you.
I was joking. You don't have to send
storyboard
it
stuff.
to me. Sorry. I'm finding this incredibly valuable. It's wonderful. Do you ever miss or pine for working back on paper?
I still, when I do my layouts, I use the same process I talked about when I'm laying out a comic. When I do my initial thumbnails, so I still do some stuff on paper when I'm drawing a storyboard, but time constraints being what they are, mostly that's just drawn right on the screen. I still work on paper when I'm doing, hang on a second. I'm working on a page right now for my book called Rogue's Kingdom. I don't know if you guys can see.
Oh, that's stunning. That's really lovely. And you're inking that as well?
Yes, so I'm inking it, and that's on paper. So I still work on paper when I'm doing comics, mostly because I think I have a better handle on what it's going to look like when it gets to the printed book. When I try and ink and draw digitally, I tend to zoom in too tightly, and a lot of the detail that I put in just gets lost in the printing process. So I find that working on paper keeps me from doing that.
Do you ever find that you are, I find this, that you are over particular digitally? So for example, if I'm in my sketchbook and I mess up a line, I'll let it go and I'm happy with the happy accident. But digitally, it's so easy to correct it that you correct it. Is that one of the differences for you working on paper, that actually those accidents make your work express more emotion, feel better, feel more alive?
Absolutely. I think that the Control-Z is a fantastic function, but it's when you're working digitally, it's almost too easy to back away from something. So yeah, I still work in my sketchbook. I still draw on paper. When I do the drink and draw stuff, I mostly just use a ballpoint pen because if I'm trying, like, once again, Dan and Dave are really great at their brush work and their line work. But for me, when I try and make a pretty line, it slows me up mentally. And so I start thinking about the line as opposed to the overall drawing. But when I'm just using a ballpoint pen and a cheap piece of paper, then I can create a little more freely.
That's awesome. I'm going to open it up to the audience now and get some questions from them. Are you happy to answer some questions from our audience?
Awesome. Yeah. Yeah.
Cool. Does anyone have any questions? Oh, I don't think they do. Has anyone got a hand up? Oh, yes.
I've got a question, because you worked on, I think you said Young Justice. Just wondering what you did on that, because it was really good, so yeah.
The question was because the gentleman asked, what was your role working on Young Justice?
Oh, I was a storyboard artist on the first season of Young Justice.
And can you explain? Can you tell us a little bit of the process that I know you've explained being a storyboard artist, but what did it entail on Young Justice specifically?
So Young Justice was it's an amazing show, and was a very dense show. So it required a very fast-paced, frenetic show. I think one of the things that made it popular was that it is so full. There's so many things happening in every episode. So we would often overboard for that show. Like say, if a show is supposed to be 18 minutes long, it's 22 minutes long as a show, and then 18 minutes is basically how much storytelling time you have with credits and openings and whatnot. So we would often board 25, 30 minutes worth of episode and then cut that down to make the most fast-paced, dense, exciting show possible. So that show was really different because we had the budget and we had the time to do that, and that was sort of part of the process. So it was different. So that was exciting, and that was fun to participate in, and it was a different way to make a video, because when I talk about being 10 minutes of stuff left on the floor, that's all good stuff. It just wasn't the best stuff. So in that regard, it can be frustrating when you liked a piece that you put in, but it got cut because it wasn't the best. So I think that show was different than other shows I worked on, which had a much smaller budget and a different time frame. And so everything you draw winds up in the board because that's just how much time you have.
So I have a question following on from this gentleman's question. Because Young Justice was a team show, do you board differently or do you prepare differently for a show that has many characters than one with, say, a lead protagonist like the Spider-Man show that you worked on?
Absolutely. Young Justice was a great show, because there were so many characters, but luckily they're all kind of the same size. So when you're doing group shots, you just have to move those elements around in such a composition where you have to fit them all together, but they're all the same size. So it's pretty easy to do by moving them in and out of space and maybe putting one guy up on a little bit of higher level or whatnot. And so a team book in that if they're all human, is complicated, but still mostly just a mathematical problem. When I worked on Transformers, it's also a huge group book, but they're all different sizes. So it's little kids, it's little robots, it's gigantic robots, it's dinosaur-sized robots, it's adults. And so the compositions of having a group scene where you have Optimus Prime talking to a Dinobot and to the little kid, that becomes an art form in and of itself. How do I make sure, where do I have this kid sitting? Is he sitting on top of an Autobot's head, or is Autobot sitting on the ground? Like that kind of composition becomes a real headache.
That, I would assume, though, that's where digital technology becomes incredibly helpful.
Absolutely, especially if you have 100%. It's much easier if you have a 3D SketchUp model of, say, their headquarters, and you can build, we would build that option in. We would have, in the Transformers Prime headquarters, we made sure that there were raised levels with staircases and catwalks so that you could put people where you needed to have them, so that you could have an Autobot talking to a human and they could be eye level.
With regard to the Transformers, with them being very blocky, specifically the G1 ones, and I remember Prime being G1 based-ish, but did it have a Sean Galloway-esque feel where they were quite narrow at the waist and quite elongated?
Could you say that again?
Sorry,
I didn't understand the
sorry.
question.
I'm trying to. In my head, I'm trying to picture Transformers Prime. Is that the series where the characters had quite narrow waists and were quite elongated?
Oh yes, no, they're very tall. Yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. It's the CG one. Yes, they're all very long and tall. Yeah.
So my question was going to be, with G1 Transformers being very blocky, they must have been slightly easier to board, but it's not relevant because you were working on Prime.
Yeah, but I imagine that the same the same compositional problems have always been involved in the Transformers. If you have a giant robot and a kid, then you're going to have to play some games.
So do you have a property that you've not worked on that you'd love to have a crack at?
The other day we were talking about Warlord. So if I was going to do something at DC, I would love to do a Warlord cartoon, or if I was going to do just a straight up Conan cartoon, I think would be the most fun.
A proper swords and sorcery.
Yeah, a full blown Conan or King Cole cartoon would be really, really great.
So what are you working on at the moment, and do we get to have a peek?
Oh yeah, so I showed you a little bit of Rogue's Kingdom. I don't know if I have any more pages up here. I don't. Oh yeah, here's a page that is in the process of being finished.
That's really lovely. It's exceptional.
So they're fighting a Minotaur kind of character and this little kid. So on this particular, on Rogue's Kingdom, I have actually sort of used my animation background, and I'm doing a lot of 4 or 5 panel vertical panels or horizontal panels dropped vertically to sort of capture the idea of a letterbox full screen. So that's kind of the gist of that book. As animation goes, I'm not really doing anything at the moment. It's mostly just working on the comic.
Your page intrigued me. Do you ink straight over pencil, or do you use a light box? Because the page was incredibly clean.
Yeah, so I will pencil it, and then I will use a ballpoint pen to basically do like loosely pencil, and then I'll use the ballpoint pen to do a clean pencil where I break down all the drawings and then do all my rough construction, and then I will light box that and use actual black India ink to do the final inking. So it's a long process, and so my pencils are mostly just done in ballpoint pen.
Cool. This has been incredibly interesting. Thank you very much. You have been awesome. Before we go, could you talk a little bit about the Drink and Draw, and indeed tell our audience where they can find you and where they can watch you?
Oh, yeah, absolutely. So Drink and Draw started, I guess, 2005. My friends Dave Johnson and Dan Panosian, we all lived in Los Angeles, but we all worked all the time, and we never really saw each other. And so Dave had this amazing idea of let's get together and have a beer and then do some drawing. That way basically it was Dave was single time, and Dan and I were married, so he knew that our wives couldn't complain if we were actually drawing and practicing. So and it worked. So we would go out every week or so and hang out at a bar and draw and drink. And then as we were doing that, other artists heard about it, other animation and comic book artists in Los Angeles heard about it, and they would join us. And then from there, that stretched out from comic book and animation artists to fashion design artists to graphic design artists to anyone who just liked to draw would come join us at the bar and hang out and drink and draw. And then we put out a book through Image, and then I think we put a second volume out, but now I can't remember the publisher. So we put out a book, and that sold out. It was a big 12-byte album-sized of all the drawings that all of us had done from the Drink and Draw events. And it had a great collection of stuff by me, Dave, and Dan, but also had an amazing collection of artist who were just there and loaned us their artwork. And so once that book came out, then we started to open up chapters kind of all over the place. And when I say open up chapters, I mean that other people had drink and draw events. So we had drink and draw in Milwaukee, drink and draw in New York, drink and draw in Montreal, drink and draw in Paris. I think there's a chapter pretty much in every major city I can think of. I know there's one in Hong Kong. So we basically I think the idea that drawing could also be fun and social really caught on, because everyone I know as a kid draws, and at some point you stop doing it. But it is really fun just to draw. And then drawing in public, it's like visual karaoke. You just kind of hang out and enjoy camaraderie and other people doing what you're doing and having a drink. It's a lot of people don't even drink alcohol. Like, we had plenty of teetotalers come and just enjoy the group and the creative environment.
You'll be pleased to know that the drink and draw that we threw last night in Coventry Cathedral had hundreds of people. Genuinely
fantastic.
hundreds.
Oh, I'm so sorry I missed it.
Absolutely fine. We'll send you we'll send you the photos and video footage. Ian Churchill was there drawing along. John Higgins was there drawing along. We've even got drawings from Kieran Gillen and Al Ewing. So it was a really, really, really good event, and you were missed.
Excellent. I'm very happy to hear that.
Thank you for your video, though. It was great. Thank you.
Just at some point, so that's the history of drink and draw, basically, and we started doing the live show on YouTube. I guess 2 years ago, a year and a half ago. I can't even remember now. And that we would just get together and talk about stuff and chit chat about art and hang out, because we're all so far away now. Like, Dave had moved to Georgia. I live here in Oregon. Dan's still in LA. And then Joe Quesada is off doing his thing. And so, but that gave us a really great opportunity to have people like Walt Simonson come on, and Bill Sienkiewicz and Howard Chaykin and Neil Adams. So we could come on and actually share that experience of the love of drawing and the just the environment of creativity online, and so everyone else can just watch and hang out too. And then we get it's been a lot of fun. I think I don't know how many views we have, but I think people are really enjoying the hangout time.
That's a really, really lovely note to end on, because
Oh, good.
our whole event is about drawing. It's about getting people to draw, and not necessarily draw, but to tell a story. And drawing is just one form of storytelling, whether it's one picture or many pictures. Obviously you and Dave couldn't be here, so thank you very much. Couldn't be here. So thank you very much for joining us digitally. That's amazing.
My
thank
pleasure.
you. And hopefully we'll see you soon. So I'm just going to say to the audience, can we give Jeff a big round of applause, please?
Thanks, everyone.
Cool. Jeff, you've been an absolute star. Thank you for joining us today, and thank you for joining us yesterday. It's been brilliant. You've been amazing. Thank you. Thanks a lot.
It's been my pleasure. I hope to see you next time.
Cool. Cheers. Thanks, man. I'll speak to you soon.
Okay.
Bye. Cool. Thank you very much. I hope you guys maybe learnt something, maybe took something away from that, and I hope you enjoyed the festival. So thank you very much.